Hello, you are listening to Germantown Community Radio WRGU 92.9 FM. Welcome to the Jumpstart Philly Real Estate Radio Show, a weekly radio program that spotlights positive real estate development and neighborhood revitalization throughout Philadelphia. I'm your host, Derek Hengemil. Jumpstart Philly is a unique community development program that trains, mentors, networks, and provides funding to aspiring real estate developers in 7 different Philadelphia neighborhoods, including Germantown, where the program was founded. Jumpstart believes that you can do well by doing good and focuses on removing neighborhood blight, scattered site rehab, creating a healthy mix of affordable and market rate housing, and avoiding gentrification through slow, steady growth and keeping wealth local. Interviews are conducted during Jumpstart Germantown's weekly Jump in Our series on Monday nights at 7 p.m., held via Zoom webinar. And for more information about these events, you can check out the events page at jumpstartgermantown.com. This week, I'll be speaking with an accredited appraiser, Felix Aguirre, about everything Jumpstarters need to know about residential appraisals. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and be sure to check out the podcast version of this program at jumpstartgermantown.com/media. Felix is a certified residential real estate appraiser licensed in Pennsylvania. He performs appraisals for single-family to quad-unit properties in the greater Philadelphia area. Prior to working as an appraiser, Felix worked for major oil companies and engineering companies and held positions in computer-aided drafting and design, construction maintenance, and environmental compliance. He has a BS in Civil Technology from the University of Houston and is a member of the ASA, which is the American Society of Appraisers, in the Philadelphia chapter. So it's great to have him tonight, and I'll let him just introduce himself real quick. Felix, how you going? How you doing?
Good. Derek, I believe you've done, a pretty good introduction. I could only go downhill from where you left me. So
great. Well, why don't we start off? Maybe you can just tell us about your background a little bit, and maybe that's a good way for you to introduce yourself personally. How'd you get into appraising?
Okay, well, just to be honest, I got laid off. It's that simple. Yeah. I was working for an oil company after being relocated in 1998 from the Portland, Oregon area, and I was covering about 200 service stations from the standpoint of construction maintenance. In other words, say they had a problem with one of their tanks, one of their pumps, etc. I would have to keep up with that and maintain a group of contractors to get out there, resolve the problem, and kind of coordinate all those issues. Right. They decided to sell those facilities. Once they did that, they eliminated my territory. Okay. So without a territory, it leaves me without a job, and without a job, I wanted to get into something that didn't involve sales. So I started, inquiring around, found out that in real estate, you don't necessarily have to sell to be involved with real estate. You could appraise. Appraisal has more to do with analyzing and doing some of the things that I was doing before, like inspecting properties, looking at the site, surrounding the properties. And that kind of appealed to me. So that got me into it.
Cool. Yeah, well, I guess if you can inspect an oil rig, you can certainly inspect a Philly row home. Is that right?
Well, it wasn't an oil rig, but for example, when I was in Oregon, I was in a facility that was a marine terminal that received gasoline, from barges. And, that was a pretty large facility. It had quite a few tanks, diesel, gasoline. So a lot of things happened, that could involve environmental compliance, construction, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, if you have a perspective for that, you can translate it to something smaller.
Gotcha. So then what exactly type of appraising do you do nowadays? And what are your typical clients like?
Well, typical clients are primarily banks, but there are also individuals. There are individuals that want to get an idea of the property they're living in for future sale. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, you have unfortunate circumstances like a divorce, and you have to have a settlement of assets between the parties. So that requires an appraisal. And sometimes, you get called in for an inheritance tax situation, and there are other cases, but primarily about 80% of the business has to do with lending and banks, lending
right.
purposes.
So
it sounds like you have a lot of experience in a lot of different types of appraising and a lot of parts of the industry. And I'm sure that makes you quite adept for estimating a home's value. And that kind of proves the point as to why you're telling us about appraising rather than just someone who knows a lot about real estate, right? It's more of it's a calculated craft, would you say?
It's a calculated craft, and you do have to have a sense. They've attempted to quantify as much as possible. And when I say they, I mean like the major entities like, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac and stuff like that. Some of the aspects of real estate appraising, but there's still an art to it. So, you can only quantify so much. So at some point you have to understand neighborhoods, get trends and all that kind of stuff before you could start coming up with an idea where the value needs to be for a certain area.
Yeah. And that's what I'm looking forward to talking about is those trends and stuff that happens outside the home that changes its value rather than the bones of it.
Sure.
So I want to jump into like the meat of an appraisal and what the process looks like. But before we get there, I kind of want to tie the topics here together because you have a call full of developers, not a call full of bankers. And
sure, I understand. Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, that's your clientele. It's great to have you here, and you can kind of give us the other side of the perspective and look at it from a different angle than what people would, a developer would typically see as an appraisal as. So what is an appraisal to a single family home developer or somebody who's doing their first, second, or third project? What does it mean for them, and when are they going to be considering it?
Okay, it's a fair question. I would imagine, and again, from your perspective, I'm not exactly sure how your program works, but I would imagine you have to have some seed money before you start the process.
Right.
For an example, I don't know with your program how much you loan, but isn't someone that's starting to develop supposed to come in with, say, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 for starters?
Right. So for Jumpstart, for example, it's an 85% loan to cost ratio. So we fund 85 and you have to bring 15 to settlement.
Okay. So they have to come up with $15,000. It's not easy to come up with $15,000, correct?
Right.
So it's a possibility. I don't know, but possibly a cash out refi on existing property or one of their investment properties to come up with a $15,000, $20,000, $25,000. And that would require an appraisal, a lending appraisal.
Okay. And
so that's one option.
Yeah. So that's before development, right?
Right. Before development.
Right. So it seems like that's the first option. Then what about on the other side of things? Once you finish a development, could you be considering a reappraisal or an appraisal then, like especially when looking at refinancing?
Well, in that case, what I would think might come into play, say, for example, a developer has finished, let's take, a mid to smaller type of developer who's just bought a single family home, rehabbed it and got it ready to resell, right? That person may be wanting to continue and add more properties to their portfolio, right? They're just starting, they want to grow. So they may want to take that property, sell it, right? And obtain a refi so they could obtain monies for the next project. So that would require an appraisal, right?
Yeah.
So, in going to the second, third, fourth properties would require appraisals.
Yeah.
So that, learning that process would become important, especially if you want to grow, as you go.
Yeah. So now let's take a step back and go even more basic. And what's your definition of an appraisal? Is it a dollar amount? Is it a report or some, you even mentioned to me how you can do an appraisal for the rent of a property. But what would you say is like the textbook appraiser's definition of an appraisal?
Well, an appraisal essentially is an opinion of value. Okay. But how you get to the opinion of value is the process of developing the appraisal, right? Because anybody can come up with a number. However, if you happen to be an appraiser, a licensed or certified appraiser, if you give somebody that number, it becomes an appraisal. So you have to be careful how you develop that number. What's been arrived at to kind of legitimize the process for appraisers is something called USPAP. It's a Uniform Standards for Professional Appraisal Practice. It is a set of guidance on how to come up with a finished product. And it doesn't, it's not you could expand on it, but it is a minimum that all appraisers have to adhere to. There, and the standards are such that they tell you how to ethically come up with an appraisal. They tell you how to prepare the appraisal. They tell you how to the minimum standards as far as maintaining ethics, as maintaining records, as maintaining all the records and all that. So it's all written down, and the main purpose for it is so people have trust, and it's not just a number that somebody came up with, but something that's been not just written and provided to the appraisers, but actually becomes law, because based on that document, the state of Pennsylvania could actually issue penalties, and they could, just monetary penalties, and even jail time, actually, if somebody violates USPAP to that degree. So it always refers back to USPAP. Now, it has a lot of flexibility if you read it, but you can't just make large errors that mislead the client. And in this case, it would be the developer that hires the appraiser.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like it's a little bit more involved than just a number that they're giving you. It's a real comprehensive look at the entire, all the different. Right.
That's what it's supposed to be. Yes. And that's why that's the difference between, for example, on agents say, yeah, I'll list your property for X.
Right.
And versus an appraiser saying, okay, I appraise your property for X. Gotcha. Because an agent has that flexibility. They say, okay, I'm out on the street. I know how many listings I made. I'm ethically bound to some degree, but I don't have a governing body telling me that I have to do X, Y, Z before I can come up with an opinion. I can come up with an opinion. I'm free to do that.
Sure. Now I want to ask you your tips for someone who is maybe looking to do their first refi. They just bought a property and rehabbed it, and they're ready to rent it out and get a refinance on their loan. Where does someone begin to look for that? Like, we don't provide a list of refinance or appraisers or anything, or you might not know that if you don't have friends that are in the real estate industry. And this is, I'm setting you up if you want to plug your own services here right now. But where do you suggest someone looks?
Okay. In the case of this particular group of people who are investors, it's always good to find appraisers that are familiar with the area you're in, for starters. Okay. And that's pretty easy because the state of Pennsylvania always provides a list of appraisers by address. So you could always pinpoint, if you get into the, pa.gov and just navigate down, drill down until you get to the appraiser section, you can find appraisers in your area. So that's a real general way to look for appraisers. In my case, in my organization, the American Society of Appraisers Philadelphia chapter, we have appraisers that work in the Philadelphia area, obviously, and are familiar with the various neighborhoods. So basically, that would be one of the first questions you would want to ask the appraiser. Are you familiar with the general neighborhood I'm in? So you don't want to get somebody coming in from out of county, way out of county, to do the area you're in, especially if they're not experienced, which is one of the things that comes up in USPAP. It's geographic competency, very important part of USPAP. So.
And then do you just, select which one finds right? Or is there any weight in that decision of, like, if you have two candidates, should you be looking for certain qualities in one another? Or is it pretty much a standard practice?
Well, the number of years do not necessarily tell you, how experienced the person is. You could have an appraiser that's been appraising for 30 years, but they may have been doing the same thing over and over and over again. So they really haven't learned anything, with breadth, I think the general questions you would ask is some of the questions you're asking here in this webinar. It's like, how much experience do you have with investors? Just ask general questions like that. How familiar are you with this specific neighborhood? Have you done some appraisals in this neighborhood? What types of appraisals?
So let's talk about the appraisal process. And I know you have a unique perspective of this because you are an appraiser. But maybe we can walk through, once someone decides that they need to get an appraisal done to whenever they end that process. What does that look like, and where does it start? Does it start with a physical site inspection?
It doesn't have to be a site inspection, although I think that it helps a lot. If you have, if you're meeting with an appraiser for the first time, this would be a great opportunity to answer some of the questions you were just asking about. How does this appraiser feel, what kind of experiences does he have or she have in this specific neighborhood? Mm-hmm. So if you're having to meet with the appraiser, this would be a great time to, sort that out, because you'll ask them or her questions directly about that. So that's a good starting point to have the physical inspection of the property. At the same time, this gives the appraiser and the client the opportunity to, work through the scope, just like you have a construction scope of work, you have an appraisal scope of work, mm-hmm. which defines the main steps that you need to take to come up with the eventual opinion of value. So if you're able to, do the site inspection, at the same time, get a good definition of the scope and understand the purpose for the appraisal, it all makes the rest of the work flow a lot better, in my opinion. It doesn't have to be done that way. As long as you have enough data, you can do it either, as a drive-by, which is a common way to do it. You could even do it as a desktop, as long as enough data is there to come up with the desired eventual opinion of value,
Okay. All right. So once that site visit happens and you're moving along, whether you do it or not, what would the next thing you look at to be? So let's look at it from two perspectives, I guess. Maybe the first is before the project is developed. So you're walking into like a gutted home or a home that's, in dismay and ready to get rehabbed.
Okay. All right. All right. Why don't we just make it even more specific? You have a gutted home and it's a single family home. Okay. So the thing I would look for as an appraiser would be to try to get as much information on that proposed improvement as I can. Mm-hmm. If I could get a drawing, that would be ideal. Mm-hmm. If I could get a drawing from the client that tells me, okay, this particular house is going to have, 3-4 bedrooms, 2 mm-hmm. baths, is going to have a finished basement eventually. Mm-hmm. It may have a driveway for parking. It may even have a parking garage. Mm-hmm. It makes it so much better to be able to account for all those factors so that when you're comping out the property, you know what you're looking for. I mean, even if it's gutted, I'm going to be able to come up with square footage. I'm going to be able to come up with finishes because I'm going to ask for, the specifications of what, the finishes are going to be like. So you're going to be able to even comp out condition. Mm-hmm. I mean, these days, a real estate agent will give you so much information on a listing. It's unreal. I mean, they will give you finishes. They will give you how recent the finishes were made. If you take the time to, scan through the photos, there'll be 40 photos listed in the MLS, the multiple listing service. Right. So, if you could get that up front from the client, it makes comping out a lot easier.
Right. So a developer who's looking, like we said in that case, to get financing for a project, before the work starts, they should really be working to get all that information they can to the appraiser, right? That's
absolutely. Yes. And they would probably want to do that anyway, right? Because if they're going to have that eventually built, right, you mm-hmm. need to have that information provided to the contractor.
Right. So if you're doing your job right, it should be no easy. It's an extra.
You don't want to have it in a little napkin somewhere,
No.
You have,
Sure. Cool. So then I guess that's as much as we can talk about in the home. And now tell me what goes on in the comparable search outside of the home, in the neighborhood and the trends, like you were saying.
Okay. Well, being in the Philadelphia area, what happens, that you could be in a specific neighborhood and all of a sudden you're driving around and you see a house selling for $60,000. And you go down 3 blocks and all of a sudden the house is selling for $500,000 and you're wondering what the heck is going on. Mm-hmm. The shell is similar, so you have to kind of ferret out what's happening. Is this a shell? Is this a REO? It's a distressed sale. Mm-hmm. So that analysis, that kind of mentality has play in, as you go from block to block to block, and if you're able to find the most similar comps, you're gonna have better results. In other words, you have properties that you could tell are, they're rehab for resale, really nicely done, and your property is going to be the same way. It's going to be a rehab for resale. Then you have a pretty decent comp, provided that the other things are similar, like they're close to each other, recent sales, and the distance between them is reasonable. You don't want to be miles apart, especially in Philadelphia.
Right. And are appraisers just using like common realtor tools like MLS and services like that, or is there some
special? There is no magic as far as what appraisers refer to. I mean, for the most part, most appraisers in our area use Bright MLS as a primary source of finding comps and listings. Bright MLS, and a lot of people use Redfin. A lot of people, but Bright MLS, I would say, is the predominant, the most used. I know there are plenty of others, but that's the one I use, and most of the appraisers I deal with use Bright MLS.
Right. So then beyond just what the surrounding properties are selling for, how about market trends? Do you look into the analysis of the real estate market as a whole, or are you really just looking at those recent sales comps?
Well, right now the market is crazy, as you probably know. The lack of available properties available for purchase has caused a real imbalanced market right now, where there's competition for homes. But as things balance out, usually what you find is that the trend analysis gives you a pretty good idea of where the neighborhood is and where it's been, over the last year. So if you take a snapshot of the neighborhood in a year, you get a sense of where it's going, how fast it's appreciating or depreciating. Mm-hmm. And, as long as you're, not out of the ballpark of that neighborhood, you should get a pretty good sense. And there's some differences of opinion. In general, I've always looked at competitive properties when you're looking at the analysis. In other words, any neighborhood in Philadelphia will have a shell property going for $25,000 to $1 million, within half a mile radius. Yeah. So you can't just take that and come up with any significant analysis of where the market is. So you look at competitive properties to kind of narrow the range. You have to have a lot, but competitive,
Gotcha. So once all that data is gathered and once you get this full look at everything, is there like a formula that goes into this calculation of the appraised value, or do different appraisers do it differently, or kind of how do you get from large picture to a dollar amount?
From looking at the market, what that does for you is, in some cases, you're only able to come up with a certain number of really good comps. Okay, not all markets have a plentiful number of comps that are, right, really good. So what happens is sometimes you have to make time adjustments to those comparables. And if you do a time adjustment, this is where this comes in. You look at this overall market analysis. You say, okay, this is appreciating about 6% a year. So you break that down, 0.5% a month. Mm-hmm. So you make a time adjustment, okay? Mm-hmm. In addition, you make adjustments for other things, like differences in what we call GLA, which is gross living area, the size of the home, and differences for other things like, number of baths, whether or not it has a garage, various other things. As you shrink down the differences, the ideal, which you never reach the ideal, is for the comparables to be identical to what we call the subject, which is the property you're dealing with. Right. But that never happens. You always have variances. Mm-hmm. But that's the thought that, you get perfect comps, you adjust them down, they look just like your subject.
Right.
Okay. It happens that way.
Yeah, gotcha. And hopefully, that's what would happen to the home, right? Is when it's finally developed and it's ready to sell, it fits right in there. It's not something way out of the blue, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. And then, once you have that dollar amount, how do you go about presenting that to the developer? Does it come in the form of a report, or do you just email them the dollar amount? What's that look like?
A form of a report is usually the best thing to do. And let me explain why, okay? It's not like a lending, in this case, it wouldn't be like a lending form report, which is a lending form report. It's called a 1004 typically if it's a full report. But it's just like the lending form report, except it has the specific scope that we talked about earlier, right? Tailored to that specific project. So, you define the scope, the form is very, very similar to the lending form, and then you prepare the value within that form. Now, the reason why it's probably best to go that route is because even if you just prepare it in a letter form or email form, like you said, the appraiser still has to maintain all those records in their office.
Right.
So the thought is, if you don't hand over the report, that file in your office has to be documented well enough to that somebody could pull it and generate that exact document that you told the client to back up that number.
Right.
So you do it anyway. In essence, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So you might as well come up with a report.
Right. And that report kind of is like showing your work, right?
It's showing your work. It's out there. It's easier to show anybody. You give the client a PDF or whatever version they want to use, and they could just show it. It's they're the client, and
And then that report should kind of serve as a reference source for the developer, I guess, because that's a bunch of information. That's a bunch of research.
Got a lot of information, and if what you're really interested in is obtaining a lot of good comps for sale purposes or whatever, you make that up, known up front and let the appraiser know, hey, just give me 6 good comps, whatever. So they know that I have to do a little extra work, but that's part of the deal. That's what they agreed upon.
Gotcha. So, and I'm sure somebody has asked this in the question and answer so far, but my last question about the appraisal process is, what happens when somebody disagrees? What happens when you hand over a report to somebody and they say, no, I don't think that's right at all? Does that have any value to it, or do you just say, sorry?
No, it has a lot of value. But the thing is, you have to go back and you have to, think about what may have gone wrong. Yeah. Number one, I would go back right to the starting process, the beginning. I said, did we do the proper scope of work? Did we miscommunicate at that point? Because that's like the most important part, right? Mm-hmm. So let's get past that. Let's say we got that right. Then I would say let's look at the physical part of the appraisal. Did we miscommunicate in the number of bedrooms we're going to do, the size of the property, the number of baths? Is there, did we get all that right? It could be that, we missed it. You expected, you meaning the client expected 4 bedrooms and the appraiser understood 3, and based his appraisal on 3. That's an obvious, miscommunication. So that's, and you need to go back and correct that. And, it could be that the comps that were selected were poor comps. And, if you have good knowledge of the comps in your area, just review them and present them to the appraisers as, why didn't you use these?
Mm-hmm. Right. So then if there is that disagreement and say the developer was right, they said, hey, you got the wrong number for this or whatever the reason may be, then do you just update the report and send it, or do you have to go through any more?
Yeah, if it's an obvious miscommunication, then you just go back and correct it. I mean, that's all there is to it. I mean, it's anybody could misinterpret something if it's not, like I said, if you start from the scope of work and you miss it at that point, it could just ripple, it could have a trickling effect all the way through. So,
sure. Okay. All right.
Have to get on the same page.
Yeah. That's what it sounds like. And I think my last question here before we move into Q&A, I see some people are submitting questions. So thank you for those who are doing that. I want to tie it back again to the developer and look at it from their perspective. What tips do you have for a first-time, second-time investor who's never gotten an appraisal before? What can they do to make sure that appraisal goes smoothly and that they get the value they're expecting? I think one thing we hit on early on was like showing or doing that due diligence and providing the appraiser with the work they need. But what tips do you have, or what common mistakes have you seen?
Okay. All right. The only thing that I'll just put out there is that, appraisers are, especially certified appraisers in the state of PA or any state for that matter, they're not supposed to be led in any one direction when it comes to doing an appraisal. In other words, if there's a predetermined value, the first thing that needs to happen, if it's known to the appraiser, there's a predetermined value by the client, and then the appraisers, what they're supposed to do is just not accept the assignment.
Gotcha.
So, they're supposed to come up with their own conclusions after they do the work. So that's the main thing. Other than that, I think we covered the other part, if there is a disagreement, right?
If you're just tuning in, this is a conversation with accredited appraiser Felix Aguirre about everything Jumpstarters need to know about residential appraisals. Thank you for listening to the Jumpstart Philly Real Estate Radio Show on Germantown Community Radio, WRGU 92.9 FM. I hope you're enjoying the discussion.
Jihad is wondering, are there different types of appraisals to arrive at a value? So I guess maybe is there different strategies, or is there a different, could you ask for a different classification of appraisal?
Yes, that's a good question. As far as the different types, I think maybe what he may have meant is, are there different approaches to it arriving at an opinion of value? And yes, there are different approaches. Okay. Although the sales comparison approach is the most common, there are other approaches. For an example, the cost approach, it's most applicable when the property is newer. Okay, say for example, you're doing a ground up building, then the cost approach is very applicable because you have a lot of cost manuals. The most common one is the Marshall and Swift Residential Cost Handbook. It's used by appraisers, it's used by insurance adjusters, but there are plenty of others, okay? And they usually, what they do is they maintain the cost for the components of a home. And based on that, you come up with an estimate for the building materials and an estimate of the site. You put the two together, and you come up with the total cost, and you subtract out the depreciation for the age. It's like a 10-year-old home, 15-year-old home. Right. So that's one way to do it.
And will the appraisal or will the appraiser communicate the method that they're using, or will?
Sure. Yeah, sure. You're supposed to reconcile before you get the final opinion of value. You're supposed to come up with a reconciliation session explaining which method you used and why you gave the particular method more weight in the final opinion.
Okay.
So that's one. So there's another one called the income approach, and that's predominantly used when you're dealing with rental properties. And what you do there is you come up with, in the case of a residential appraiser, you come up with rents of comparable properties to come up with what's called a GRM, a gross rent multiplier. And if you have a GRM, if you have a sale price, and you have you can come up with a value of a house. So you come up with several rentals to arrive at a GRM, several comparable rentals, and then you could back into a value for the house. So that's another valid approach. Okay. And again, you would explain that in your reconciliation.
Gotcha. All right. Next question here comes from Keith, and he's wondering what aspects of a property do not contribute to an appraisal. That's a good question.
What aspects of the property do not contribute to value, or do not come up in the appraisal?
I guess maybe you can answer it the first way, or the appraisal. So what aspects of a property do not contribute to an appraisal? Meaning, I guess if there's things that
do not contribute to value.
Yeah. So if two properties had the exact same things except for one feature, it wouldn't matter.
Okay. Yeah. All right. From my perspective, like anything that you could take with, for example, a spa that you just put in the back of a big pickup truck and take to the next property, that probably would not contribute to value. Another would be like like one of these above ground pools typically does not contribute to value. You just break it down and take it somewhere else.
Gotcha.
I hope that's what he meant with that question. I don't know.
I think so. So anything that's not like fixed on the
Not
property,
fixed, right?
I think that's not too hard to move. That makes sense. The next question comes from Uche, and they're wondering, how do you approach valuing small multifamilies? So 1 to 4 units. Do you use comps, cap rate, multiple gross rents, any other metric? So would a small multifamily unit be any different than the process you've described?
No, it's very similar. You do comps, right? And then you come up with rents, or the same process that I mentioned a second ago, just the DRMs, come up with rental properties that are similar. And in the 2 to 4 unit, they want to see both. They want to see the comp approach and the rental approach. So they want to get data on both. Now, and if you want to add more like the cost approach, if you feel it's applicable, then you would add the third approach as well. But the two would be minimal, the minimal approaches that you look at for a 2 to 4.
Okay. All right. So Lynette asks another question. She's wondering, I've had an appraiser ask me what number I had in mind. Was that inappropriate? And I think we'll know.
Yeah, that would be like where he could just turn his license at the door and say, bye-bye, birdie.
Cool. All right. That's a quick answer for that one. Next comes from Carmela, and she's wondering, what about yard size? Does that affect the appraised value, and how much?
Well, what's typical in your neighborhood? I mean, in some neighborhoods, it's typical to have 1+ acres because they have septic tanks. They need it.
Mm-hmm.
If you get out, drive around the 5 counties surrounding, 5 surrounding counties, you'll see that 1-2 acres just because they have the septic systems. It's required by their townships. And, as you get closer into the city, the smaller, in South Philly, you could have a minuscule little patio, maybe 8x10, and, that's all you get. Mm-hmm. So how much does it contribute? Are you the only one that doesn't have a patio? It's nice to have a patio.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how much it ties back to what's in the surrounding area.
Yeah, it ties into that because if every single neighbor has a nice little, you're able to put a little deck in the back, and you're the only one that doesn't have space for a deck, then
it's like almost less about what the property does or doesn't have. It's about what it has compared to everything else.
Compared to, yes.
That's important. Okay, next question comes from Kim, and she's wondering, does a basement being finished or unfinished add to the value of an appraisal?
A basement, if you have a 2 to 4, a basement, the lower part is actually can be considered what they call GBA, gross building area. So, like if you have a duplex up, like above grade 1, 2, and then you finish the basement, then all of a sudden you have a triplex.
Mm-hmm.
Because you finished a 3rd unit, as long as you have the proper ingress, egress. So yeah, absolutely, it adds value.
Okay.
It's important to make sure it's dry. You don't want a basement to get mold and all that kind of stuff. So
and we're on a nice pattern of questions here. The next person is asking, do the appliances that are in a household contribute to the appraised value? So I guess that's something that could be considered fixed or not fixed, like a washer, dryer.
Well, it's a little different because, like appliances in the kitchen, for example, the range, you could theoretically take the range out, but, appliances do obviously add a lot. You want to get into a kitchen that's well equipped with a fridge, range, dishwasher. So all those add to value, right?
Gotcha. And next we have a question from Damani, and she's wondering, how big of a role does price per square footage play with your assessment with the subject and comparables? Do you consider this an adjustment in your report? So that, again, that's price per square footage.
Okay. Absolutely. Especially in the case of as you compare to other comps in the neighborhood, you could end up with a situation where you're just not finding comps and you have what's considered a large variance. Say you're comparing a 1,500 square foot home to a 2,500 square foot home. In some cases, the square footage is not going to contribute as much, but at any rate, you could do an analysis to see how much square footage is contributing to value. Mm-hmm. That information you could abstract, you could obtain it by looking at it, do analysis to get that information. So yes, it absolutely does. Yes.
Next question comes from Tariq, and he's wondering, what improvements, features, or trims do you see properties tend to include but do not generate a return on investment? So he's thinking like a developer here, and he's thinking,
Yes.
what can I skip that'll
What
not?
can you skip?
Yeah.
Well, obviously the things that, get looked at a lot are like the kitchens and baths and flooring, right?
Mhm.
What can you skip though? I would say probably on the outside, on the back, the patio, you don't want to skip things that are going to really bite you. Like, you don't want to leave a leaking roof or anything like that.
Mhm.
And I would say anything that's maintenance related, that's not handled, it's going to come back and bite you, So, make sure that you don't have any, problems in the basement when you're taking in water, roof leaks, anything like that.
Right.
So do a good job with that. But, in the back, the patio may not be something that gets paid as much attention to. I think everybody looks at the front porch. You can't help but look at it, right? But,
Okay. Yeah. And I guess, and this is, again, thinking from the developer's perspective, but it's maybe homeowners sometimes like if there's something that they can work on or do themselves or like custom make for their own project, or if it's a home buyer, they might really want to put in their own deck or something like, so I guess like extra features like that, right?
Extra features like that. Yeah. One thing you don't want to spend any money on is any customization. You want to keep it plain vanilla so that whoever comes into the property can make it their own, So no, not a lot of custom trim or anything like that. You want to keep it more general, more generic.
Okay. And I'm asking yet again another how much does this contribute to the value of a home question? But Kim is wondering how much does curb appeal contribute to the value of a home? So
yes. Absolutely. And it's one of the easiest things to remedy if you have a bad place, because, the front of the home is probably the front facade. Make sure you have the proper landscaping, the proper paint, and all that. It's a little easier to remedy. You don't want to, have a front porch that looks like all the wood planking is coming apart and, have termites up there and stuff, So you want to spend money up there to make it look good.
Okay. And next is a sort of follow-up question to back when you were talking about basements and how if you finished a basement, it could possibly be considered a extra bedroom or like a 3-unit, go from a 2-unit to a 3-unit. What would the tip breaking point be there before it goes from being considered like a basement to a bedroom? Could you clarify like when it becomes a basement? Is there?
Well, you have to have the proper entrance and exit. It can't be all underground. If you're able to go in, you have to be able to go out. No fire problems, and I'm sure L&I could give guidance on that. So as long as it's safe, code.
Okay, great. And this is it looks like our second to last question here from Stefan, and he's wondering, could an investor submit pictures of the work that was involved in the renovation to use for consideration when getting an appraisal? Would the pics be taken into account when determining a value? So I guess painting like the before and after picture of a project, would that help?
Yeah, that would be part of the before, but in addition to the pics, you would want more. You would want, a drawing of the proposed improvements, and
so I'm thinking about it from the other side.
The other side after it's done.
Right.
Yes, the pics are good. It's I think in most cases the appraiser has the burden of doing the inspection, the final inspection, just to make sure it is as the pictures show that it is.
Right.
But just a verification of the pics is it's a good idea.
Okay, great. And our last question here, and we'll wrap things up, is from Rhonda, and she's wondering when does zoning come into appraisal? So do you consider a project that's verified or that's zoned one way to be more valuable than another?
Well, zoning is very critical because if you're trying to do something that's not zone compliant, you're going to have a problem, right? If particular zoning does not allow 2 to 4 unit, then, and you build a 2 to 4 unit, you're not legally compliant. So
yeah.
it's critical.
You have some bigger problems than the appraised value, right?
Yes. And the appraiser should be able to point that out. I mean, right from the scope of work, they should be able to, there's something called highest and best use. Right. And one of the things that's part of highest and best use is, is a property legally, can it be legally done, Yeah. So zoning answers that question. If it's not properly zoned, then it can't legally be done.
And that concludes my conversation with accredited appraiser Felix Aguirre about everything Jumpstarters need to know regarding residential appraisals. And next week I'll be speaking with Elizabeth Beckett, who is the president of Real Estate Strategies and RES Advisors, about strategies for market research and how you can conduct your own market analysis when approaching investments. The interviews on this program are recorded during Jumpstart Germantown's weekly Jumpinar series, which takes place via Zoom webinar every Monday night at 7 p.m. And if you'd like to participate in the live Q&A with our guest, be sure to head to jumpstartgermantown.com/events and register for next week's Jumpinar. If you're interested in starting a Jumpstart program in your own community, you can visit gojumpstart.org and see our how-to guide and open source training workbook. Thank you so much for listening to the Jumpstart Philly Real Estate Radio Show on Germantown Community Radio WRGU 92.9 FM. And be sure to tune in next week.